The relationship between South Africa and the United States has become pretty toxic. Just how bad it is, we're going to find out from Dr. Colin Clarke, the Director of Research at the Soufan Group, a global intelligence and security consultancy. Welcome, Doctor.
Thanks for having me.
Doctor, how would you describe the current relationship between South Africa and the US?
I would say, within the contemporary era, it's certainly heading toward what I would call a nadir. I mean, in the post-apartheid setting, really the government's drift toward Russia, particularly accelerated during the post-invasion of Ukraine phase, is puzzling to a lot of foreign policy watchers, including myself. I think there's a lot of contentious issues here between the U.S. and the South Africans that include failing to counter the financing of terrorism, but also just generally, what's seen as a foreign policy that accommodates Moscow and other rogue regimes.
What do you make of the visit to the Ukraine by South Africa's president and other African leaders?
I have to say, I think, some of the behavior that we witnessed was quite shameful, that the South African delegation denied even a missile strike on Ukrainian territory the day that it occurred, and it was clear for all to see. So I'm not sure what the end game is there. I think it's incredibly myopic and short-sighted. Certainly the South African government has the right to pursue whatever foreign policy it wishes. It just doesn't seem like there's a real coherence there. It seems very almost ad hoc in some ways. Again, if the government drifts towards the Kremlin, that's its own business, but there are real consequences in terms of foreign policy in other countries, including, if not especially the United States, that this government is alienating.
Well, there's been bad blood ever since a U.S. ambassador accused South Africa of sending arms to Russia in a time of war and sanctions. That was supposedly based on intelligence. Do you think that intelligence was credible?
I do think it was credible. I think for it to be raised to that issue and become public, there certainly was validity to it. I think we're still trying to understand the scale and the scope of what the weapons looked like. But the fact that this report surfaced in the first place, I think, is troubling. And I would just say this to the government in South Africa: you're betting on a losing horse when you cast your lot with the Kremlin and with Moscow, because if you just look at the way that Russian military forces are behaving in Ukraine, not only are they drastically underperforming from a military perspective, and so the government of South Africa is hitching its wagon to a loser, but moreover, they're committing, clear crimes on a regular basis against Ukrainian civilians. And so I just don't get the end game here. And it seems very counterproductive, in my opinion.
Well, what does Russia still have to offer South Africa for its loyalty?
Well, I think there's a lot of nostalgia going back to the relationship during, the Cold War and those longstanding ties, which I get. South Africa gets an audience, a willing and engaged audience. Russia has been actively courting the global South. It's a fellow BRICS member, and so there are real points of commonality there. But again, if you just look at the behavior of Putin and the regime, it's really, it has very few friends left in the world. And I wouldn't want to be among the rogues gallery of the North Koreas and the Belaruses of the world. And Syria that still consider themselves a close ally of Moscow.
How severely can the U.S. punish South Africa for this stance? There are fears that South Africa could get kicked out of AGOA, that there could be sanctions imposed on us.
That's a great question. I mean, I think that these are issues that if things keep trending in the current direction will be on the table. And, I can't speak to the extent of just exactly how bad the relationship has soured within the respective governments, but it does seem, when you have conversations with folks in Washington, that South Africa is doing itself no favors in this regard. And there's a number of other issues, I think, that are left unresolved that South Africa is grappling with internally, that it could use help with, and certainly doesn't need to endure any kind of economic sanctions or other penalties when it's struggling to get certain aspects of society up and running.
Do you think the U.S. would go that far?
I don't know. And again, you have to think about change in administrations, potential for elections in 2024, what the various kind of pet rocks, if you will, of distinctive foreign policies look like. In the past, well, the previous administration, the Trump administration, was notoriously moving toward kind of an isolationist streak and disengaging from certain parts of the world. So the question becomes, and it's hard to fathom this, but it's certainly possible that Trump could be the president again, which is kind of amazing to say. Does that kind of, how does that impact the relationship, right? Is it kind of a back burner issue because Trump doesn't feel the need to engage as directly with countries like South Africa? I don't know. There's a lot more questions, and I think it largely depends on the behavior of the current government.
We're looking forward to watershed national elections next year. How do you see that playing out? Is there any real danger of foreign interference in our elections?
I think there's always a danger of foreign interference in any election anywhere in the world in the current era. The barriers to entry for states and non-state actors, including individuals with nefarious intent to meddle in elections, as I mentioned, the barriers to entry have been lowered significantly. And so it's not difficult to get into this game, to learn how to spread disinformation, to utilize various emerging technologies to do so. And look, it can be done on the cheap. If you've seen some of these deep fakes and different disinformation campaigns, they're not necessarily overly sophisticated, but they still work. There's a great return on investment there. So I would always be concerned, no matter where the election's taking place, but particularly in South Africa, as the stakes are high, as there's the potential not only for disinformation, but for rumors and misinformation that could lead to potential political violence surrounding the election. I'm talking to you from the United States. We've certainly had our own run with election accusations of election fraud and political violence against the government. So I think, definitely, as you mentioned, a watershed election and something that the world will be watching closely.
What government would the US like to see in power after our elections next year? Would it want the ANC out or significantly diminished in power?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's beyond Ukraine. There are issues like terrorism financing, what I mentioned earlier. And I think, there's areas, there's the potential for progress there, right? Of kind of coming together and melding bureaucracies there and, providing opportunities for building partner capacity and training and issues like that. In terms of, really casting your lot with the Kremlin after this war of aggression in Ukraine and what we've witnessed, that's just, it's a deliberate decision-making of the foreign policy apparatus there. And so I'm not sure how much, the U.S. wants to see that repeated. But again, we're very wary, I think, in the U.S. of suggesting any kind of regime change toward that end, right? I mean, anytime the U.S. starts picking favorites in a country, it's almost always guaranteed to go the other way. So I think it's best that, we let the government take place and form as it will. And again, they're free to make whatever decision, suits their national interest. But I think, I would, again, strongly advise looking closely and scrutinizing some of the more recent decisions, which don't seem to make much sense.
Talking about picking sides, the US picking sides, the US is often accused of meddling in the affairs of African countries, and some of those countries feel that it's not always been to their benefit. What would you say to that?
I would say, we have to be honest where that's true. And that's certainly anyone that's a student of history knows that the U.S. has, experience there. However, I would also say, look at China and look at Russia. We're doing the similar things, whether you want to call it neocolonialism, economic exploitation, or what have you. Yeah, when people talk about a bipolar system, a multipolar system, great power competition, I always ask the question, and again, perhaps I'm biased as an American, do you want to live in a world where the United States is the global leader or Beijing is? Because I guarantee you those are going to look like two very different worlds. And if it's the latter, that comes with a lot of strings attached in terms of illiberal regimes, right? And so the U.S. has certainly made some missteps, but I think at the end of the day and on balance, it generally tries to act responsibly in the world, even if it doesn't always, fail to live up to that. Or I'm sorry, even if it doesn't always live up to its own standards. It's generally, as some have called it, a benign hegemon, as opposed to, I think, a country like China or Russia, which you could ascribe more nefarious intentions to on a consistent basis.
Recently, I've been seeing a lot of comments from people saying, why does the US think it can police us or sit in judgment over us? Because it is also guilty of hypocrisy. So why does the US think it has a right to police, for want of a better word, police other countries?
I don't know that it's policing other countries. I think it's a sheer acknowledgement that the U.S. is the world's strongest power, and with that great responsibility, including building alliances and acting responsibly in the world. Right? I don't hear many people complaining that the U.S. Navy keeps the freedom of seas open and keeps piracy at bay in different parts of the world. Right? So there's a free riding element that goes to it. There's a lot of benefits that a U.S.-led system brings. There are some downsides, and depending where you sit in the world, those downsides may be more stark than others. So I think, the Biden administration certainly is a bit more modest, and I would assess leading with an acknowledgement that the U.S. has responsibility in the world, and is less, I think, heavy-handed than, say, the George W. Bush administration, right, which was kind of licking its wounds post 9/11. And acted almost like a bull in a china shop. I think this administration is a lot more aware of diplomacy, of not kind of being seen to act constantly with a heavy hand.
What benefits would there be for South Africa if its government could succeed in repairing its relationship with the US?
Look, I think many people in the United States see Africa as the future. I mean, and I would say that extends almost especially to the business community, to multinational corporations that look at the demographics in Africa and the opportunities there for a continent that's, exploding with young, smart, innovative people that are now connected by technology. So I think there's a lot of commercial and monetary advantages in that sense. Not that that's the be all end all, but I do think that in many ways, Sub-Saharan Africa is the future, and South Africa is a leader in that part of the world. So I see a real kind of crossroads here for decisions that are being made for where that positions the country 5, 10 years, 15 years down the road.
I just want to go back to terrorist financing. Terrorism has come very close to our borders. And I recently did an interview on how terrorist organizations are raising funds on South African soil. You are the expert, however. Please tell us more about that.
We just know that there's numerous logistical nodes within the broader Islamic State financing network. We've noticed, funds have been sent by financiers operating in the Horn of Africa to South Africa, and the government has really done a poor job, in my estimation, of cracking down on well-known terrorist financiers, again, including some with links to the Islamic State and other jihadist groups. So it's a real problem, and it's one that leading experts have acknowledged.
Why do you think that the South African government is failing to combat terrorist financing on its soil?
It's likely a combination of political will, which is just lacking in that area, but also capacity. I think it takes a lot to implement and enforce a lot of these laws, and so building partner capacity and counter-threat financing, counterterrorism financing is critical. And I think, there are organizations out there that provide that type of training and expertise, but it depends on what you prioritize and what you invest in.
Do you think South Africa was grey-listed because of its allowance of terrorist financing on its soil?
I mean, certainly that's a contributing factor, no doubt. And I would, again, when you look around the world at some of these problem spots, it really behooves the government to crack down on this because, we're in a situation now where a lot of countries, including the United States, have shifted resources away from counterterrorism toward so-called great power competition and competition with near peers. And I think that, has left a lot of kind of power vacuums that terrorists can exploit. And if there is a kind of, another major terrorist offensive in the coming years, it would be really bad for some of these funds to be linked back to South Africa.
May we talk about the tricky relationship between the G7 and BRICS nations? How do you see that playing out in future?
I think it's another, kind of realization that the world is more multipolar than at any time, in a long time, right? We went from a bipolar Cold War system to, what some call the unipolar moment led by the United States. We're now dealing with a rising China, a revanchist Russia, other kind of countries like India, you know, South Africa, certainly Indonesia, Turkey, right? Brazil vying for a more prominent role, the rise of the global South. So I'd look at it as kind of the fragmentation of power in many ways. Some see it as a positive, depending on which theoretical school of international relations you subscribe to, right? Realists and others that talk about balancing and counterbalancing. But I think it's just a natural competition of geopolitics, and there's a lot more of these similar types of configurations that we're seeing with the Quad and these other kind of alignments that are now, I think, emerging. So I see it as normal competition between different influential regional blocs, frankly.
As somebody who sits in a global intelligence and security consultancy, what would your advice be to South Africa? Obviously, you see things and you hear things that us as ordinary citizens or even us as journalists don't hear. What would you say?
I would say I'll start with the more tactical concern, which is counterterrorism financing. It's a real issue, and to let that fester and metastasizes, I think, any country, doesn't South Africa, it could be any country, needs to make significant progress toward countering or combating the threat of terrorist financing. From a foreign policy or geopolitical standpoint, I don't have the hubris to say, I'm the one that should be telling the South African government what to do. However, kind of one step removed as an analyst and a consultant, it's clear that the actions that the government has kind of taken today will have consequences and implications down the road. And so be very deliberate in thinking about this, and be careful what you wish for. You just might get it. And that includes, being handcuffed to the Russians as your kind of foreign policy partner for the foreseeable future. Not a country, when you look at demographics, when you look at their economy, that I would necessarily want to put my chips all in on. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Dr. Colin Clarke from the Soufan Group, a global intelligence and security consultancy.
Thanks so much.